Thank you once again for joining us in the Access Specific User Group. Tonight's presentation is a follow-up from the presentation a couple of months ago when Tom Wickerath and I talked about migrating Access tables to SQL Server using either SQL Server Migration Assistant or a custom application built in Access running VBA that Tom was developing from the original. And a lot of questions came up, a lot of discussion during and at the end of that meeting. And I asked Kent and Tom to come back and follow up, maybe address some of the issues that we didn't have time to get into fully last time and maybe explore a little bit further. So without further ado, I will turn the time over to Kent first. If you kind of give us a little bit about your background and where you came from to get to this place to start, and then we can just go right into the presentation. Thank you. Go ahead, Kent.
All right. Well, my name's Kent. I live in Australia, Brisbane to be precise. My original background was as business analyst and consultant, and I got into software development management and eventually into software development. Strange way to get there, but that's the way it happened. I now mostly work with small businesses using Access and SQL Server, which I find is just a very efficient way of producing the processes within the business that's required. And Access is just, well, can do pretty much everything we want and more, and is very quick to develop in. So, and when you pair it with a SQL Server backend, that gives you a very good combination. Anyhow, so at this point, we're looking at when we migrate our backend from Access to SQL Server. And at this point, I have a little application here, and it's a very small application. It's just to provide a demo. And the data structures have been created in SQL Server, but the data has yet to be moved. So what we're going to be looking at here is the process of moving your data and assuming that there are going to be problems with the data, because there always is. So we're going to look firstly at having the constraints that we have in the original Access database, which may be a bit different to SQL Server. And we'll be able to look at both using system views from SQL Server and the Access backend. Now, when you're doing a migration, this is a very good time to revisit some of your business processes. Now, I'll give you an example of what I mean. Okay. And put that over here. So here we're seeing a relationship diagram now. All right, so we've got customers, invoices, products, and invoice lines. So it's a very simple structure. Now, in our customer table, we've got a customer name, a phone number, and an email address. Now, many years ago, the concept of everyone having their own mobile phone number and their own email address was, you couldn't rely on it, whereas these days you kind of can. So we might be coming from a situation where we didn't rely on phone numbers being unique, but now we've decided to make them unique. And if people have email addresses, then they need to be unique. And then we have an invoice table, which requires a customer. So the customer is mandatory, but we'll talk about a little bit more about that in a minute. And we've got our product table, and then we've got invoice lines where we have a joining table between invoice and product ID. And sometimes you need to evaluate whether you want to have a unique index on invoice and product, or whether you want to allow the same product to appear more than twice in the same invoice. And I've opted for the latter in this particular circumstance. If we go and have a look at the tables, and this is a list of tables. Now, here we've got a parent count, which allows us to put them in hierarchical order, because when we're migrating, we obviously need to migrate our customers and products before we can do the invoices and invoice lines. Otherwise, we're going to be having problems with our foreign key constraints. Now, I noticed last time when Tom was doing his migration, he did it a slightly different way, where he'd migrate all the tables and then apply the foreign keys. I do it the opposite order. I always apply my foreign keys first. And this is a SQL Server view that shows me the foreign keys, where we've got the invoice table has a foreign key on customer ID, and the invoice line has foreign key constraints on the invoice and product ID. So when we look at that invoice table, we must have a customer ID. However, when we're looking at this customer table now, we can see that I've made a record for cash, which is number 1. And we might use that as the default for invoices. So each invoice can actually default to be the cash customer, or you can select another cash customer or another actual customer. Now, here we've got some duplicate records, which was allowed in our old Access database, but as we can see in the new database, we've got unique indexes that prevent that from happening. And we'll see what happens when that happens, when we hit that. Going back to the connection, which we spoke about before the presentation started, so let's go over it again. We've got an Access backend in the same folder as this Access front end, and then we've got a SQL Server database that's installed on our SQL Server instance. Now, this connection string is built using the best available driver, assuming that the SQL Server instance is on this machine, and that's the database name, and it will produce that, which will connect to our SQL Server tables. And you'll see the SQL Server tables at the moment have a TBO underscore prefix, whereas the Access tables have a TBL prefix. And we'll change those at the end of the entire process. So now that we've got our Access tables like such, and there's nothing in our SQL Server tables, we would then create an append query like such. And this one here will append our customers into the SQL Server customer table. Things of note here. We have a join to the SQL Server table, which, if I can get it to show us the join properties, only include all records from the Access table, even if they're not in the SQL Server table. And here we've got an is null. So this is preventing us from creating duplicates in the SQL Server table. So no matter how many times you run this query, you won't get duplicates. So when we run it, we're going to hit a failure. Now, the messages we get when we run a query like this on a failure don't tell us an awful lot. They just tell us, it failed. So we're going to go, no, we don't want to do that. Now, to make those append queries, I actually use a function that iterates through the TDF of the originating table and looks at each field and builds that query on the fly. So even if I do away with that query, I can, if I can find it, show you how we've closed a VBE. So we create our append queries by saying, okay, I want to create an append query for customer, and it will build that query using the TDFs, iterating through that the fields collection in the TDF, and creating the SQL for us, and writing that back to the append query. Because it would be really painful to have to create those queries manually for every table you want to migrate in a large application. So all those queries are built using VBA. And once all those are built, we can hit a button that goes migrate all of them. Oh, it failed on entity customer. So as we saw, the message we get when we run that query tells us not a lot. So we're going to revert to a line-by-line insert, which again, looking at our VBA, and this iterates through in this case, the customer table, and tries to insert line by line until we hit the line that's causing us our problem. So if we run that, we can find the ID that's causing us the problem, which is ID number 5. Now, we can use various other little queries that help us identify problems. Like, for example, here we can make sure that, okay, everything's got a phone number. And that's not our problem. Do we have duplicates? We've got a duplicate. That's what our problem is. So if we look at TBL customer on record 5, that's a duplicate. So if we change that, and we go to our append query and run it, that's now run without error. Now we have a problem with invoice. So what's the problem with our invoice? Let's look at a query that checks that. We have a check constraint on the invoice table. That means that we can't put in dates that are greater than today. So if we have a look at that script, order table with check add constraint, invoice date has got to be less than today. So we can go back to our invoice table and find the one that's giving us grief. Oh, look. Now, if we try and do a migrate all, we've still got a problem with invoice. We run this process again. Invoice line 2. We didn't fix that. We didn't fix that date. So now we have invoice ID 3. So our duplicate is the invoice number. And that's what's causing us the problem. Okay, so we've now had a successful migration. If we look at all our tables, they're all now in SQL Server. Now, we do need to make sure that we've got the same number of records in SQL Server as what we had to begin with. And if we do, then we know we're happy. But because we just did that all itsy bitsy, and we want to really be able to run the entire process in one hit. So now that we've fixed all the data in the source tables, we can reset. So all the SQL tables are now empty, and we can run the migrate all. And it all went successfully, all in one hit. And we're ready to rename the tables, which will rename our access tables, putting a Z in front of it or something, I can't remember what. And it will take the DBO off the front of the SQL tables, and we're now ready to test the application. So that's how we affect a successful migration. So even though there's only been about 4 examples there, the use of an append query isn't going to give us a lot of information. Hence, we need to append each line of that query line by line until we find the line that's causing us the problem. And then we can easily check that particular line out, fix the problem, and move on. And that way, when we've completely migrated every table, we can reset, and we're ready for the final migration on the day when we're set to go live. But before we can do that, there's going to be a couple of other things that we need to check on. When you're migrating to SQL Server is a little bit more finicky with dates. So quite often you can have a date that's out of SQL's range, but Access allowed it to happen. You can have issues like a memo field that's got more than 4,000 characters in an Access memo field, but the SQL Server driver won't let you move more than 4,000 characters across. There can be all sorts of little things. But once you're migrated the data, then you need to start testing your application to make sure everything's working all right. And you will have other little issues like this particular one, where we're seeing a DAO record set where we're appending a new record. Now, in Access, we could actually get that new customer ID as soon as we pass the add new. But in SQL Server, the new primary key isn't created until after the update has occurred. So we need to use this move 0, find the last modified, and then we can get the newly created customer ID. So that's one of the little things you're going to come across. Obviously, in forms, if you've got code that tries to get the new ID that's being created before the form, the after update event of the form or the after insert, that ID won't be available. So you're going to have to change some of your code to deal with things like that. The other significant change you'll come across is that Access is really good at refreshing its forms if the data is changed somewhere else. If your backend is SQL Server, then not so much. You then have to start writing some code that'll refresh your forms when data changes behind them. Now, can I make that go away? I can make that go away. No, I can't make that go away. There it is, it's gone. Now, as I mentioned before, we've got some of these SQL Server views that allow us to see the tables and columns in the SQL Server database without actually having to open Management Studio to look at them. And this allows us to see everything all at once. We can see our default values, our column types, whether we allow nulls, what the data type, and this is very useful for troubleshooting, where you can have a look at, okay, so in this table, we're allowing nulls on the email address, but not on the phone number. We have to have a phone number. If there's no phone number, we can't insert the record. So this particular view on tables and columns is good for that. We've got another one that shows us all the indexes, whether they're unique, whether there's a filter on them. In this case, we've got the email address must be unique, or it can be null. So the Access has a property for indexes which has gone all the way over there. That's useless to us. Which tells the index to ignore nulls. Now, as we talked about in last month's episode, we can actually put a filter on an index in SQL Server that allows us to ignore nulls. And if you want to see the code that does that, that's it there. So we'll create a unique non-clustered index on the email address where the email address is not null. The other troubleshooting tool that's useful is this foreign key view. So we can see all the foreign keys in the application. As we saw before, we've got those ones. Now, I mentioned before about how here we go. We may decide to do something like in our invoice table, we have the customer ID. Now, we have a constraint, not null constraint, so you have to have a customer. But we might decide to make the default customer ID 1, which is our cash customer. And here's something that's really neat about SQL Server that you can't do in Access. When we look at our not our indexes, our relationship on customer, SQL Server has this really neat option, cascade to default. This is worth talking about. The following tables will be saved in your database. Do you want to continue? Right. We say yes. And what's happening here is that SQL Server is actually dropping the tables and recreating them. Now, you may need to change a setting that allows us to do that. And that's this bottom one here, prevent saving changes that require table recreation. Unless I've unchecked that, then SQL Server may not have allowed me to make that particular change. But now that I've set that, we have a look in here and we've got customer ID 3. Sorry, Tom, but you're getting deleted. And if we come back here, you notice it hasn't refreshed. Oh, yes, it has. But it's been replaced with customer ID 1, which is cash. So if you decide you want to go and delete all your customers who haven't dealt with you in the last 5 years, you can do that. And that foreign key constraint will change the customer ID in the invoice table for you back to the cash customer. Isn't that neat? Crowd goes wild.
So that's essentially a default after the fact.
Yeah.
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 So, particularly in a retail application where you want to get rid of customers who haven't dealt with you in years, and you don't want to cascade delete the invoices because that's going to mess up your sales figures.
Yeah.
That's just a really neat way of doing it without having to run a query beforehand to replace the customer IDs in the invoice table.
Do you know if any other databases support that, Oracle or MySQL, the others, or is that unique to SQL Server?
I've never heard of those other databases. No, I have no idea.
Okay.
Years ago since I worked with Infomix, but I've never worked with Oracle or.
Okay.
I was. Good question. All right, so that's my process for migrating, where I fix the source data. So I've moved my data model. I then go through and make any adjustments to the business rules that I want going forward. And then I trial migrating the data until I've fixed all of the source data so that come the day of the real event of migration, I can just hit the one button that will migrate all the data in one fell swoop, and we're ready to go. That being after having tested the application to work with the SQL Server backend. So we swap out to the new front end and we migrate the data and we're ready to go. That's it. And I think I've done that in 30 minutes. Any questions?
I have one, and there's a comment in the chat. When you're basically cleaning up the data on the fly as you're practicing, who gets the final call on whether that invoice number was a duplicate? Who gets to make the call on what it goes to instead of the duplicate? Do you go back and consult with the client, or do you just make the call?
Oh, no. Well, so as a business analyst, right, I'll look at their data and I'll go, okay, what about if we change this business rule? Now, obviously, you want to have unique invoice numbers. Yeah, okay, all right, that's agreed on. So we can now put a unique index on invoice number. And if you've got to fix the data, well, you come up with a replacement invoice number. So the new business rules are done in consultation with the client, and they should be in a written specification that says this is what we're going to do. And in the particular case of being able to delete old customers and replacing them just with cash customer, well, yeah, you've certainly got to get sign off from the client before you do something like that. But when you're doing the migration, this is the best time to sit down with your client, have a look at the data and say, well, these are better ways we can do it. Yeah. And while we're doing the migration, this is the best time to apply those new constraints and fix the old dodgy data.
So you could say that this is actually part of a larger process in which you are updating the business rules.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And when you're doing the migration, that's the best time to do it. You don't want to migrate your old problems with you. You want to create a nice new shiny database that doesn't have problems. Having said that, if there are situations where you just can't do that, then you do have an option. And you see here with check.
Mhm.
Now, when we apply this foreign key, it will check the existing data to make sure it complies. If, however, we want to ignore any of the old dodgy data, then we'd have to transfer the data and then apply this foreign key afterwards without doing the check add. Now, in Migration Assistant, SQL Server Management Studio, you've got this option here. Check existing data on creation or re-enabling. So during the migration, you maybe want to disable that foreign key and then re-enable it without checking the old data, if that's what you need to do. But personally, I would never do that because it just means you just got your old problems coming forward with you. Better to fix them.
You're keeping the skeletons in the new closet.
That's right. So, yeah, so I do a thorough analysis on the data structures and the business rules and all the constraints before I do the migration.
When a data integrity problem comes up, hopefully you've already anticipated the kind of thing that it will represent.
Well, yeah, so this is one of the problems. If you don't do a check when you migrate the data and you apply a constraint and do a no check, then if somebody goes back and tries to modify that record, then the old problem comes back and bites you on the bum because the constraint will then check a record if it's being edited. And even if you're changing the invoice date, the constraint on the invoice number is going to bite you and you go, but I didn't change the invoice number. Well, yeah, but it's now being checked. So never a good idea to use the no checks, in my opinion. So other people will ram all sorts of stuff through without.
Well, I can think of at least one instance where I wish I had done it that way instead of a week of cleanup afterwards. Yeah. I can testify to the importance of doing it that way. Yeah.
Now, a couple of other things that are interesting in the difference between Access and SQL Server. Now, if you are foolish enough to use compound primary keys in Access, you will have found that you can't have a compound foreign key. In SQL Server, you can actually include more than one column in a foreign key, but don't. Even when you're using joining tables and you think, oh, okay, I could just have a primary key on invoice ID and product ID. Well, no, don't do that. Because at some point, your client's going to come and say, oh, okay, I want another table where I can enter serial numbers for each of those products. And I've got a quantity of 2 on that line. So I need a table that will allow me to join to there that I can put the serial numbers for those 2. And you're going, oh, but it's got a compound primary key. Oh, I can't do that. Whereas if you've used an identity column, not a problem. I had once had an application where compound primary keys had been used, cascading all the way down to a point where we had about 5 or 6 fields involved in a compound primary key, and it was just a nightmare to work with. So don't ever use compound primary keys, folks. It's not worth the effort. But just so you know, in a foreign key, you can actually include multiple columns. Now, this is the other thing. In SQL Server, you notice here we've got the table name, which is like what we would call the child table. And we're referencing the table that's got the primary key in it. When you look in your SQL Server system views, they use the term parent table to indicate the table that actually owns the foreign key, which is actually the child table. And the parent table is called the referenced table. And the primary key in that reference table is called the referenced column or columns. So just be aware that there's a bit of a difference in terminologies there. Now, this particular view of the indexes in SQL Server looks very much like the one you see in Access Design View. Here you can see you've got two rows with the same index name because it includes 2 columns. And that is unique. Whereas the customer name, notice it's not unique. So I can have duplicate customer names as long as those 2 customers with the same name don't have the same phone number. What else is interesting here? Okay, so we can use filters. So that is null filter is used on a column that allows nulls. So that makes a lot of sense. The primary keys are all clustered indexes. And if you know what a clustered index is, it's kind of like the order that the table is actually in. So the clustered index is really fast because you're just going straight down the table to find the one you want. Whereas other indexes require sort of jumping all over the place to find what you're looking for. So the clustered index is always the fastest. And to my mind, that should always be the primary key. Doesn't necessarily have to be the primary key, but it should be.
Okay.
So that's kind of my process for doing the migration. Now, I haven't gone over, because it's out of the scope of this particular conversation, on creating the tables in SQL Server in the first place. But the way I do it is that I actually have this first function here, which lists all the tables and fields in the Access backend. I can then go and put in index types and things like that. So I can say, okay, I want that to be a unique index, or it's primary key, what have you. And as I showed in a presentation I did, many 6 months ago or so, can't remember.
At least that.
I've actually got a procedure that goes through and builds the tables from tables in the front end. And in that particular case, what I do is if I want to create a new field, I put it in the front end. And when that new front end goes into the test or production environment, that field is created by VBA that creates T-SQL and runs against an ADO connection.
Yeah, I'll find the link to that presentation and put it in the.
All right. Well, I haven't got any other questions. Here is my global variables, and you can. A good example here is I've got a public variable for my current DB. Now, Daniel Pinel's got a good article on why we do it this way, so that if the global variable gets lost, and they often do, it's self-healing. If the GDB is nothing, then set GDB equals current DB, and we're actually using ODB as our the object that we're using elsewhere, rather than directly using that global variable, which can get lost. And I'm doing the same thing with an ODO connection, and I also do the same thing with a file system object. And you'll notice that when I'm calling stuff, that we're just using ODB. You'll also notice that in that call to that, I also have an option there to force it. So, for example, if I've just added a new table def and I want to force that ODB to be refreshed so that it refreshes the current DB, then I can do that, which I find quite useful. What else is good? Okay, so in here we've just got a little processes for relinking DSN-less things. Oh, this process here, which will rename our access tables, put a Z in front, and then it renames our SQL Server tables and gets rid of the DBO in front, just doing a replace. And then we're ready to start testing using the SQL Server backend. And this is the little function that I stole from Mike Wolf that goes through and checks to see if what the latest SQL Server driver you've got is. Yeah. In settings, we go and get that connection string. But when we're using the ADO connection, it's the same string, but without the ODBC in front of it. But did you already know that? Oh, yeah. Okay. So there's some stuff in here which does a link on a table. And if you've got a view and you modify a view, then you've got to set the primary key in the front end, and this does that. So that's just creating a primary key in the front end. Without that, a view is not updatable. Not that any of the views that I've got here are actually updatable, but and I think, so I've got situations where I have clients who do a lot of their own reports, and I don't let them anywhere near views. I let them near stored procedures, because stored procedures produce record sets that aren't updatable, so they can't mess any data up, and they can't lock tables that may be being used elsewhere or whatever. So, and the difference between a view and a stored procedure is very little when you're creating it. For example, and you notice here that I don't go straight into design. I do script view as, create or alter to, because I don't want to use that icky VB query by design thing that SQL Server has that's not as good as the one on the Access. So here all I do is create or alter procedure. And because it's now a procedure, I can put a sort order on it, which you can't do if it's a view. The other thing you can't do with a view is send it a parameter. Like such. But apart from that, and I don't really want that. But now having done that, if I execute this, find the execute button, and now done under programmability, we've got a stored procedure. And with a stored procedure, I can then call that from a pass-through query. Any other?
Yeah, Kent, I've got a question.
Oh, good.
Those views that you had that showed the indexes and foreign keys and so on. Are those generic or are those particular to this database and backend?
They're generic.
They're generic. So I did download those files that were in the email this afternoon. I haven't looked at them. Are they in that?
Yes, they are. So you can steal them from that and put them in any database.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah.
And that will give you that. And as I just showed you, if you want to use them as stored procedures rather than views, it's that easy to change it.
Yeah, it just seemed like a really nice auditing tool to be able to go through the back end and get a big overview.
They're fabulous.
Yeah.
But what made it really difficult was the fact that with a lot of these, you've got linking on two columns. In SQL Server, your columns are identified by their ordinal position from 1 through to whatever, as opposed to in Access, where it's 0 through to whatever. But in Access, you can give two columns the same ordinal position. Access will then just order them by ordinal position and then by the name. Whereas in SQL Server, they have to have their own column ID. So when we're joining here, we've got to get the column and we've got to get the table, and then we've got to join on two columns because the fields don't have their own individual ID. They're just the column ID within the table. So it was a bit of a bitch trying to get these views to work because you had to do all these horrible little two column joins.
Yeah, you're going over my head there, but are you saying that that's done in the code?
Yeah, it's done.
Okay.
You can just copy this into any database.
Right.
And okay, I'll show you here. Look, that's using systables. The only thing you may have to do is filter that on the schema. But if you haven't used schemas, then that's not required.
Okay.
But otherwise, it gets you something.
The schemas is only if you have collision of names. Is that correct? Or
I don't use. I try not to use schemas. I have never had a real need for them, but they just allow particular people to have their own versions of things. I think I just find them.
I'm using them to give different groups of people different permissions. Is that not?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a good use for them.
Yeah.
And that's why you find them hidden down here under security.
Yeah.
So you've got users, roles, and schemas. I prefer to use roles to do that. But yes, you can use schemas.
Oh, okay. So it's a different approach to get the same effect then, as you're still granting permissions.
Yeah. Well, see here you got DB data reader.
Yeah.
DB data reader. And I've got various VBA functions that will return the role of a particular person. And even, where's a new query? Yeah, so you can get people's username, Windows username, because I'm using Windows authentication. And I kind of use that to, sometimes I use that to track who's been doing what. Can't think of a particularly good explanation, a good example off the top of my head, but.
Could you use it to identify who's using a particular function or procedure most often, or so if you can identify which users running queries more often?
You can. So if you used it in a trigger for insert, you could capture who created the record and just do that in SQL Server without having to do it in Access. So in Access, you use like the before insert event of a form. But if you're running a query in Access, well, if you run a bulk query, the only way to really get who created it is to use that in a trigger.
Well, in Access, we have data macros that function very similarly for that.
Yeah,
You
know.
you can do that. Yeah.
I know. The only place I ever use those is in like here. But I just find them a bit before change. Why don't they say before update? After update, before update. Really? I get a bit thingy about nomenclatures.
Well,
And I often work with architects, and every day they've come up with a new name for a particular entity. Some days they talk about a building, and other days it's a community, and other days it's an area, and it drives me nuts.
So
you know,
yeah, I don't know. We do have one other comment in the chat that I wanted to go back and pick up. Tom, you mentioned something earlier about cascade to null. Would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, well, so Kent was showing where he could cascade to a cache customer 1. So that was cascading to 1 automatically if he deletes the parent record. Well, kind of similar in a JET database, you could, to still have referential integrity, as long as the foreign key is not a required field, you can cascade.
but it is, yeah. So the undocumented cascade to null does work in Access. There is the equivalent in SQL Server as well, but whereas Access doesn't have the cascade to default, SQL Server does. But the cascade to null isn't something you'll find in the relationship designer. You've actually got to set it using code.
Right. So I showed you a link in the comments. I point to a link.
Yeah, there's
Shows how to do it.
Yeah, Alan Brown.
Yeah.
Alan Brown has that link. Yeah.
But the one thing I haven't, there are all sorts of other options in Access as well. There's a relationship option for join, which I don't quite understand. So you can put a relationship on that it's a left join, but I don't know what that does differently to being an actual foreign key. So there are a few other weird ones that I've never seen a need to use.
I tend to believe that the more straightforward, the better. In most cases.
Well, you'll notice that in my in those views, I do a bit of a translation to the Access data types, which you'll see here, some of those, but I use a very limited palette. For example, I don't bother about single or some of those other ones. In fact, I don't even bother using small int. I just use int. If it's an integer, I just use int. Because in SQL Server, you know, it's not going to give you that much. And I did notice that in Northwind 2, on the tax table, they were using byte or something as the data type in the join. As long as you use the same data type in the join, you're okay. But I just like to make them all ints. you can join on two date fields as long as they've got the same precision. But in SQL Server, you've got a lot of ability to join using, and you can do it in Access. It's easier to do it in SQL because you notice here I've been using CTEs to do this with rather than using subqueries down here. I just find it a lot easier to read. So all my foreign keys I tend to use int, just a long integer. And you can, okay, so yeah, bit, and that's one gotcha that you can get moving from Access to SQL. In Access, you can leave a yes, no field as null. In SQL, no, it's a bit. And a bit is a bit, a 0 or a 1. That's it. That's your own two choices. Yeah, so if you really do need to use a null, then you use a small int instead of bit. I don't know people who do that, but I've never had need to.
Do you use any of the new extend to data types? And I know that's something that we touched briefly on last time, and I was thinking about trying to dive into that at some point, but
I haven't got a good grip on it. There was an Access lunchtime session where there was somebody, I can't remember her name, but she really, knew her stuff on that. I've been meaning to look that one up.
Is that Maria?
No, I don't think it was Maria.
Okay.
It might have been, but I don't think so.
You might have missed it.
Because I know, well, maybe that was before I actually knew Maria. And therefore I didn't recognize her as Maria, but I've seen so many Maria's videos now that I would have recognized if it was her, but if I saw it now. But yeah, the whole thing about, well, see, SQL Server has got a date data type, and it's got a time data type, and it has date time data types. Whereas Access, it just had a date time. And VBA now, in VBA, you've got the date value and the time value functions, but recently VBA's made an attempt to be able to cater for these SQL data types, but I've never really quite got on top of it.
Yeah, my limited testing suggests to me that I want to avoid them. Not just because I don't have a real handle on them, it's just there were too many gotchas. Yeah, that's probably fodder for a whole presentation.
But I haven't had a need to know yet. So, you notice I do put a timestamp on all of my tables, but I can't say I'm totally on top of exactly what. I'm not an expert on timestamps. I just know I need them, or row version, or whatever they're called these days. I saw something the other day where you could actually coalesce an actual date out of a timestamp.
Because it is a relative time, is what it boils down to.
Its purpose is really to make sure that you're not getting clashing of editing. Like if somebody else has edited the record since you opened it, and then you change the record, but they've already changed it, then timestamp will tell you to.
Yeah, the timestamp will be different, and that will tell you can't do it. So there's another question in the chat. Stephen, would you like to unmute yourself?
So going back to the VBA code, when you were showing stat RST equals ODB, I understand about the ODB and how it continually checks itself and the connection and all that good stuff. What I don't understand is what is RST? Is that a global variable as well? And
no, it's not.
Okay.
I keep them local.
Gotcha. Okay. And it's local within the form itself, right? Like the module?
Oh, within the procedure.
Within the procedure, gotcha. I was just curious on that. So that I know sometimes if you open multiple, you got to close those out and not just set to nothing. Sometimes they'll still be in memory sometimes.
Yeah, I'm pretty particular about making sure I close my record set objects. So set record set as TDF is nothing there, but
Yeah, it's the
where I,
last one, you put in the function, I think, it's one there on the
yeah, well, see, when I declare my variables at the top, I always put the objects first and then the data types after that. So I can go, okay, I've got an RST and a QDF that I've got to set to nothing.
There's sometimes where if you don't close it, there's nothing. There's sometimes errors are occurring and that's still being tied to that. You don't put RST.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, they're supposed to destroy themselves when they go out of scope, but you can't trust them.
yeah. And then there was one other thing I wanted to mention. I did develop a function and Access that I created where you pass the name of the table. It loops through all the fields. It identifies the different data types and it does a creation, like it does a create SQL query. And it worked for a lot of tables. And then I would just copy paste the create SQL code in SQL Server and it created the table for me. The only problem is when fields got kind of long, like 100 or so, it got just the string was too long and then you couldn't concatenate it. So I had issues with that. But that's how I did it to pass from Access to SQL to table.
When I'm creating tables, I create the table with nothing but the primary key. Then I add the other fields. So it's easier to troubleshoot. If you're trying to create a table with all of the columns at the same time and you have a problem, not so easy to troubleshoot. But if you create the table with just a primary key, okay, that's good. Now I can start adding all the other fields. And if I hit one that gives me a problem, well, I know which one it is.
And then my final question is where we have some scenarios where I put everything in SQL, but yet SQL is not able to be connected. So I have a lady that may come in at 6 in the morning, but we may not get IT support for SQL to come back on 8 in the morning, but she still has to work. So what I have to develop is the ability to still work in temp tables and then pass that to SQL Server. So is there any out there to where you can be temporarily disconnected from SQL Server, add it to the tables, and then feed that information to SQL Server when it's back up? Like, has there anything that just consumes what the database tables are and attempt to put it in SQL Server and then make sure that there's always a connection, and if it breaks, they'll use the local tables? Like,
Many years ago, I was doing software for event registrations. And in that particular scenario, we had to cater for if the network went down, people could still register to go into the conference or whatever it was. So there was a local access database on each machine that was being written directly to, and it was synchronizing in the background with the SQL Server database on the server. And if the server went down, well, people could still register. And then when we restored the connections, everything had resynchronized. A lot of work though, but
because there's transactions involved, right? So that there's a time stamp of when that occurs, and someone could hit multiple entries, and you got to consolidate those changes. Where let's say someone's changing the same quantity of a product, and they happen to be in the same database, but they're disconnected from SQL Server. So what you're telling me is just disconnect it all in Access and just behind the scenes have it send to SQL Server. That's kind of better than trying to manage that disconnection from SQL Server.
yeah. So she can't get access to a config manager that would allow her to start the database. Why is the database not?
My application.
Why is the database not working early in the morning?
Because it was directly connected to SQL Server. So that there's links that the tables are being viewed and it's logging people whenever they open it. So there's actually like a DSN link that it's using to edit the data. So I have to make it smart enough to know, well, that connection's not there. And I'm using DAO to check the record check.
Is that because it was a DSN, or because I'm using DSN-less connections where as long as you've got access to the server, you're
Yeah, that's the issue, that the server's down. It might be down 2 hours until IT can put it back up. So
I'm not sure I understand. So you're saying that the SQL Server goes offline?
it's a possibility if it's down.
Oh, okay. So it's not a regularly scheduled thing.
Correct.
It's, oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, it might
And
be a
you're-
machine that I'm mindful of that
Yeah.
needs to be.
Okay,
in
the question
environment.
then is, are we using SQL Enterprise or just SQL Express?
It is a not SQL Express. Say it is a lot of SQL. Yeah.
Because
But
if you're
I-
using SQL Express, you haven't got replication. But if you've got an enterprise license, you could use replication to do it, and with a local SQL database. And
Yeah, there's no backup for
and-
this server that they have. So if it fails, then they have to restore some image, and so that takes.
So
a lot
it,
of hours.
yeah,
so it's more of an emergency situation rather than a planned.
Correct.
Okay, yeah, because I once worked in a place where our database was rebuilt overnight from a data warehouse. And as the data set got larger and larger, the database came back online, or the rebuilt database came back online later and later in the day until it was like 10 o'clock in the morning, a lot of mornings before it was available again. And that was a huge pain.
but see, with the event registration thing, when you're dealing with events, you got to have backups. Everything's got to work. Like, the show must go on. So it was worthwhile doing that synchronization. But it is a lot of work.
Is it possible? Yeah, it just occurred to me, SharePoint. And I just said a dirty word, if you'll forgive me, but SharePoint actually does work disconnected.
Oh, it does. Well, okay. When you say SharePoint, we're talking about lists.
Lists, yeah.
Yeah, and I have done this, but then, as Albert pointed out, you're limited to a few thousand records at most.
Yeah.
But your SharePoint lists will synchronize themselves. But if you've got a big SQL Server database, no, that's not going to help.
Yeah, it's not a viable solution, but
Like
No,
that would be
but,
the. It would be ideal if they had, you went ahead and you connected like these DSN tables here. That Access would automatically create something temporarily if you were disconnected, and then it would send back those transactions when you're back online for you. That would be like ultimate for putting in.
But it's got to be a
putting
two-way connection, because you've got to get the records. Like, for example, if you're trying to create an invoice, you've got to have the customer records to be able to create the invoice.
in.
So it's got to go in both directions. And that means either an Access or a SQL Express instance on your local machine that then synchronizes with SQL Server on the data server.
Even if
Notice
it's
I said
like,
data
as soon as
server.
you connect the DSN cable, behind the scenes, it's putting a hidden temp table there. And throwing those same records going in there to anything that's not aligned with SQL Server when you're down. And monitor the changes and then send it, and all the tables, anything that's, and have that monitoring piece. Otherwise, you have to create that from scratch. Just that ability.
but- Yeah, and as long as every record has an edit date and a add date or a created date, then yeah, you can do it. You can just say anything that was edited after this. If it's different on the server, then we need to synchronize it. So yeah, as long as you've got those two date fields of add and edit, that's the major part of it. However, what was I thinking? But then, as I showed you before, where you've got those append queries. So in this instance, that's your server, and this is your local table. And if we're creating a new customer, we can't get a duplicate because that one's already up there. So you've got those append queries that will go both ways. The other difficulty with that is that if you've got an identity column, you have to make sure that you're not getting clashes in the primary key field. And in that situation, see, SQL Server has an option for identity insert. So you can insert an existing number into an identity column in SQL Server as long as you've got identity insert turned on. And you can only have that turned on for one table at a time. But Access is really quite clever in that when I do a query like this, Access handles that identity insert, which means that the ID that was created by Access can be inserted into SQL Server. Now, on the local machine, if I've got new records that start at 100,001, and there's not going to be a clash with another machine that might start with 200,001, then you can be inserting your identities without much of a problem. But there's a few gotchas involved in the process. And that's one of them. So the dividing up the process of synchronizing, you divide it into two bits, doing appends of new records, and then you do updates of records where the edit date and the created date aren't the same. It's sporty, but if you've got really, really well controlled naming conventions, then you can write a process like I've done here that means that you can write code that writes the code. And if it works for one table, well, it'll work for all of them. But there are two types of tables. There are entity tables like customer, and then there are transaction tables like invoice. Now, theoretically, transactions should never be edited. They can only be appended. If you're working with a bank, that's going to be true. If you do a bank transaction, you can't edit a bank transaction. You can do another transaction to make an adjustment, but you cannot alter the transaction. However, in a lot of applications, you see developers letting people make changes to transaction records, which to my mind is an evil sin, and it makes things a lot harder. But if you have good, solid naming conventions, then you just got to get the process working for inserts and the process working for edits on one or two tables, and that'll work for all of them. But if you use, and this is why, you know, and George will attest to this, why I never use plurals for object names, because you just can't get consistency.
Right.
Hence the TBL prefix, which I, you know, as long as you use a prefix or something, because, you know, using plurals just doesn't work. But if you're consistent naming conventions, yeah, you can create a process that'll work for two tables and it'll work for 100. But yeah, synchronizing a local machine database with a server database, yeah, it can be done.
But you wouldn't call them table customers. That's what you mean, right?
Oh, no, I wouldn't have it cut.
Yeah.
Even worse examples are like companies, where you can't just take the S off the end and put an ID on the end to make it the primary key name. Then when you come across a table for status, what are you going to call the status table? Statuses, status I, what? You just can't be consistent.
Consistency and simplicity.
Yeah, well, I'm nothing if not simple.
Yeah. So am I. I'm famous for that. So, and well, let's not go down that path. We're past our presentation hour. We're still recording. Are there any other questions, comments, or discussion about this topic?
Just a quick question, I think. So in the consistency, I think what I hear you saying is that it's TBL customer and it's customer ID and customer name, and that's consistent across all types of tables? Is that your point?
See, well, in fact, if I have an underscore name, it will be 100 characters. in wherever it's used. Underscore number will be either, in some applications it's 20, but in others it might be 30, but it's the same everywhere. So when I'm doing like validation in subclasses, like for example, in a text subclass, I don't need to know which table it's coming from. I just need to know if the suffix is number, it's going to be 30 characters.
Right, right.
If the suffix is name, it's going to be 100 characters. As long as it's consistent throughout the whole application.
And
email
also
address,
the beginning of the field name is equal to the table name less the prefix.
in the majority of cases, you can see customer name. So customer ID, whether you use the underscore or not, just for me, it makes it easier to get that suffix off. But yeah, so it would be customer name. Yeah. So, but if you've called the table companies, well, what are you going to call the PK name? Customies ID? Companies ID? Or, English just isn't consistent. And then when you get to, anyhow, you get the point. Now, there is big arguments to be had on whether I should have called this customer phone number, where you should have that entity prefix on the beginning of each of them. And in some cases where you've got the same column names used in different tables, that can make sense. And sometimes it makes sense to actually have the same column names. So when you're joining on, and as I mentioned before, in ordinal position of columns, I always put the foreign keys. I start off with the primary key first, then I have the foreign keys. So when you're doing joins like this, those joins are always at the top of the table. Now, here I'm connecting product ID to product ID. And there is an argument for calling this product PK and this one over here product FK. And I can't see any reason why you shouldn't do that as long as you're consistent. So, there's various ways you can skin the cat, but it just comes down to being consistent. And here we've got product price there and product price there. Now, it's debatable whether you should call this one over here invoice product price, because it's not necessarily, this column here will default to that value, but then it can be changed. So that's why it's not referencing back to product price. It's actually a separate field that inherits from here, but doesn't reference. And whether they should have the same name or not, there's an argument either way.
It comes down to preference. If there are any more questions or comments, I'd like to stop the recording pretty soon here.
Just one from me, if I may. Kent, thank you for that. Good introduction, and I particularly liked your some of your SQL queries to extract from the server. Just your thoughts on Access Migration Assistant, SQL Server Migration Assistant for Access. Have you had a play with that before?
Oh well, yeah, years ago, but I kind of gave up on the migration assistant because there were problems. Then the new version came out, and there were other problems and whatever. So I ended up just rolling my own. But it's gotten better and better over the years. And watching George use it the other day, it is, it's pretty good. I mean, if you're only doing one migration, you would use it.
Yeah.
But if you're going to be doing lots of migrations, as I do, then I roll my own. But for a one-off.
This session actually grew out of a session 2 months ago when we did side-by-side comparison of SSMA and a roll your own version that Tom Wickerath presented. So if you go back and look at our video from 2 months ago, you can.
Okay, thanks. Sorry I missed that one, but no, it was. I found it to be very, very good, and particularly if you take your time to ensure your yes nos are converted to bits correctly and little things like that, and But yeah, that seems to, I've found it working very well.
Yeah.
Just one more while I'm there, if I may. I've got a project coming up migrating to SharePoint because the client doesn't want to pay for a SQL Server, even a free one, but they need it in the cloud. So we're looking at SharePoint. It seems with a few bit of testing I've done to migrate quite straightforward, just using the buttons and the database tools ribbon. Have anyone, yourself or anyone, tried anything on that?
Well, the only question is how many records you're going to have to deal with. Is it a few thousand?
Yeah.
Or is it more than
in some
10,000?
cases.
Yeah, the limiting factor, as Kent says, is the number of records. So theoretically, you can go up to 50,000 or more, but practically fewer than 10,000. So that would be a bright line that I would talk about with your clients. Actually, years ago, I did a SharePoint migration, and we actually have a presentation from a year ago. Albert Kalal, do you know who he is?
Oh, he's the expert.
Said of him, I think.
Yeah, he actually did a presentation on migrating to SharePoint for this group. It's about a year ago.
And what Albert doesn't know about SharePoint isn't worth knowing.
Isn't worth knowing, yeah. Hang on a second. Let me see if I can. Oh, Kent, can you share the PowerPoint again? I may have put that link in there. I'm not sure. I would be, go to the last slide. That one. Nope, I don't have it in there. I will add that and put it in there. But I was going to mention some of these other tools, but SharePoint lists are idiosyncratic.
They're not a relational database.
Yes,
they can be used as such quite successfully, but they're not really a relational database.
Yeah, and that's where you get into the weeds a little bit. You have to use lookup fields, the ones that we love to hate in Access. The only way you can enforce referential integrity between SharePoint lists is if you use a lookup field. And if you do that, it will enforce primary key, foreign key on those tables.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and actually there's a mechanism to do that. So I guess I didn't put it on there. So maybe if I can grab screen share back from you.
But yeah, they can be very useful for small databases.
Yeah.
SharePoint lists. And yeah, they work offline and they synchronize themselves, which is really nice.
This is our playlist. And there it is it's called Access plus SharePoint. And that would have been a year ago.
I'll go and check that out. Thank you, George.
Yep. And Kent's previous one is this one here. And we talked about that.
So why don't they want to use SQL Express?
They need it cloud-based. So I was looking at an Azure solution for them, but they didn't want to pay another monthly fee.
Well, the problem with Azure is you don't know what that monthly fee is going to be.
Yeah.
The calculators don't make no sense to me. The best way, probably the most efficient way, is that you can get hosting for a remote desktop RDS with connecting to a SQL Server database, and you can even use the Access runtime if you don't want to give everyone Office licenses. And that can be a cost-effective way of doing things. And there's a few people who offer that kind of hosting.
Yeah, again, I think the cost per license of remote desktop's kind of a little prohibitive for this client at the moment.
Yeah.
Are they not-for-profit or
a school?
Yeah, well, you probably find, like, I found one mob in Sydney And on one of the Access forums, he goes by the name of Auntie Jack, and he does hosting for that kind of thing. And I think he does a pretty good price for like schools and not-for-profits and what have you. And if you're just wanting to use the runtime with SQL Express, that's probably quite cost effective.
Yeah,
It was a
well,
Gorrell
Azure's pretty
release.
good too, but there's some good prices on Azure, but even then they wanted to avoid a monthly bill of any sort, basically, for the admin and everything else. So they had a whole bunch of reasons, but they said,
Yeah.
we've got SharePoint, can you make it work with SharePoint? So yes, I guess we can.
All right, but if you're using it remotely, all right, even you can actually just have a physical machine on their peer-to-peer network in the office, and people can connect on using ODP for free if it's Windows Professional, and they can work remotely, but they're actually working on a physical machine in the actual office, where it can be connected to SQL Express. And that's probably the cheapest way of it not costing you anything else. You just have to have, even just cheap PCs on your peer-to-peer network, and you got people remote desktoping into those.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought too. Yeah, I might look into that one some more. Thank you.
Yeah. So here's where you do that in SharePoint. You create the lookup field, the lookup column, and it's going to, you get you specify which table it comes from, which column, and then you enforce referential. They don't call it referential integrity. They call it referential enforced relationship behavior, but it has the same effect. So you can
Right. So the reading I've done seems to imply that it is running SQL Server back end to drive SharePoint.
Yep.
And looking at the migrating a trial little database I set up in Access as a trial, it directly from Access by moving it to SharePoint, it created all those lists and the relationships between them based on the Access tables already existing.
Yeah.
It does that well.
It should do that. Yeah. Keep in mind that there's generally a limit of 5,000 rows to be indexed, which means that if you push 6,000 rows, you can't index them. So if you need to have fields indexed, make sure you don't send more than 5,000 records in the initial migration. In other
Good
words,
tip. Thank you.
Yeah, that's something that bit me more than once.
But I think if cost is if you've got a large database and cost is a real thing, then remote desktop to physical machines is probably going to be your cheapest way of doing it.
Yeah, I would definitely look at that over SharePoint.
Right. Okay, we'll check that one out some more. Thank you.
Right. Okay, so is there anything else that we want to dive into? Oh, there's one more comment in the chat, and this goes back, I guess, to earlier discussion of disconnected updates. John, you want to unmute yourself and elaborate?
Yeah, sure. I had a BE on my front, or an FE on my laptop, and I needed to be able to connect to a SQL Server actually running on a machine in my office over cable internet. And I just used linked tables, and it turned out that, you're not supposed to connect a front end to an access back end because it'll corrupt the back end. But it turns out with SQL Server, when you do that, the mechanism seems to be that it will open a connection, read the data when the form loads and it needs to grab the data. It'll open a connection, read the data into the form, and close the connection. And then you can do your edits and all that stuff, and it will open a connection, write, and close the connection. So SQL Server is very robust in terms of preventing that kind of corruption. It was slow. It would take a second or two. I mean, this was years and years ago, so I can't really talk about it too much, but it worked. Just linked tables over the internet to my
Actually,
system.
I was doing the same thing with that event database too. So there was, so there were Access databases on each machine that connected to a local SQL Server database that then connected to a SQL database in the sky. And it was just, using that connection string with an IP address or a USP, one or the other.
It was so long ago now. I don't remember how I did it. I was just connecting, so.
Yeah, but it does work.
It does work.
Yeah.
It was slow. I have to say it was slow.
I've always been fortunate to work with clients who either were all on premises or all on cloud, and I didn't have to fool with that kind of stuff. So it stunted my experience, but it was a lot more fun to work, I guarantee you. So John, now that you have spoken up, gives me an opportunity to introduce you to the group. Last month, Eric Blomquist gave us a presentation on using classes to sort and filter lists, and he cited some work that John had done. So as a consequence, made a connect. John, I don't know who contacted who first, but we made a connection, and John has agreed to come in September and do a follow-up presentation on his work, some seminal work, I think, on using classes. And you want to give us a quick preview of what you anticipate?
Sure, I will. One of the things that I wanted to ask, listening to the people here, I was under the impression that it would be a wide range of newbies down to old timers. It sounds like most of the people in this chat room are pretty much old timers. Is that the case?
No, yeah, I'll have to put my hand up to that one.
Yeah. I think looking at the names, I only know, I mean, the people that I know and people I've seen in this group and elsewhere, we're probably not newbies, most of us.
Okay, so then the next question is, how many people in this group have worked with classes where you actually sync events out in classes, in your classes that you create, and raise events in your classes that you create?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, I would
Wouldn't
love
mind
to learn
hearing.
how to do that. I don't use the, I've done it the hard way.
Okay.
I think it's safe to say that Kent and you are probably the only two who have done that extensively.
Okay. Well, that makes me
I've
feel
got
a little better. I was beginning to think perhaps my presentation would be preaching to the choir. But basically what I'm going to be discussing is how to create a class, how to use with events to sync events from something that you pass in, like a form or a control that you pass into your class and save locally with events. And then you sync the events in your class and you do something with them in your class. And then your class can raise events, and other places out in your program can dimension a variable and set it to your class with events, and it can sync events from your class and so forth. Just as an example, a quick example, I have a control at the top of a form that is a record selector. It's a combo box, and it will be the name of a person, the person table or something. So you select something in that combo box, and it will sync the form that combo box is in to that record. And it'll move the mouse cursor into that record so that you can start editing data in that record. And if you then down in the form move to the next record, the combo box syncs to the form, and it's all using events. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about, and we'll be discussing when I do my thing. That'll be in September.
September. Yeah, we're looking forward to that. Yeah. Actually, in August, and I'll branch off that, I've asked Tom Van Stiffout and Kim Young, who I worked with on the Northwind 2 update team, to come and talk to us about error handling. And Tom wrote his error handler using a class. So he's promised to talk about error handling in general, but that will include the class that he wrote for the Northwind developer edition for the error handling as well. So there's sort of, we're kind of putting feelers out in lots of different directions. I get bored if I do the same thing all the time. So I really appreciate people willing to share a variety of experiences, backgrounds, and skills. And I'm looking forward to that. Next month, while I'm on the subject, next month, Greg, whose last name I think is either pronounced Reagan or Regan, I can't remember how it's spelled, wants to do a presentation on creating beautiful interfaces. And I think that's, again, in that same vein of a slightly different topic, but still related to what we all do and love best, which is access. So looking forward to that as well. Thank you, Kent. Tom, did you have anything else you wanted to add? We kind of ran away from it.
I think I'm good. You're going almost 2 hours now.
Oh, you're right. Look at that. Shoot. I do this every month. I get caught up in discussions and I forget. And my job is supposed to be watching the clock and stopping it, and I never do. So
we need to buy you about $25. A nice Brent Ozar uses it. A little sand trap timer.
yeah, I need something right in front of me.
Decorative one.
Yeah, I think I need something right here in front of my keyboard so I can't ignore it. Okay, great. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope to see you again next month when we get a look at some new ideas on creating beautiful interfaces for Access. Thanks again, and I'll see you next month.
Thanks, George.
Good night.